back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and this is 10 cards you should be putting in your Commander decks, episode 24. Starting out this week with Carnival of Souls, 1 and a black enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you lose 1 life and add 1 black mana. Very interesting, very powerful effect. Okay, the first thing of note here is whenever any creature enters the battlefield, this includes your opponent's creatures as well. So this card can be dangerous. You know, your opponent plays an Avenger of Zendikar, gets 10 plant tokens. You're gonna add 11 black mana to your mana pool, and you're also gonna lose 11 life. So there's some risk there. This is not an optional effect. This is not a may. You have to add the mana and you have to lose the life. And chances are you're going to get all that mana on your opponent's turn and maybe not be able to use it. I don't know. Maybe you are, maybe you're not. Probably great in any deck where you have a mana sink, okay? Maybe if you're playing a Thrasios deck in black, now I can put all that mana into my Thrasios, you know, so you're never going to have unwasted mana. Maybe I got a Helix Pinnacle in play, so I can chuck the mana into that. And then obviously on your turn, it's going to be a lot more usable. The lose life part is maybe the tricky one. If you got a Soul Warden in play, that completely undoes the symmetry here. So now whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you lose a life, then you gain a life, so it's not going to hurt you at all. It's sort of like with a Darien deck a little bit, the way Darien decks work, where I got the Soul Warden or maybe the Soul's Attendant, and so any life I lose, I will immediately then gain it back. You could do the same thing here as well. But obviously, you could get into some pretty crazy shenanigans here with this. I'm sure there's definitely some combos that exist. Coming in at number 2 this week, Carpet of Flowers. And this is probably one that I'm sure a lot of people have seen before. Gets played a lot in CEDH. 1 green mana enchantment. At the beginning of each of your main phases, if you haven't added mana with this ability this turn, you may add X mana of any one color, where X is the number of islands target opponent controls. So you're going to play this, and the great thing about it is you can play this on your first main phase, and then on your second main phase it will trigger because you haven't used it yet, and you pick an opponent, whoever's got the most islands, and you add that much mana to your mana pool of any color, right? Any one color you want. It gets used in CDH a ton. It's really great in CDH, mostly because, well, I mean, it's free mana, that's always good, but also a lot of people are playing blue. A lot of people play blue in general in Commander, so it's a pretty good card all around. That's why it's so expensive. Really great in a casual game though too, right? People are playing blue in casual games a whole lot as well, so it's just free mana every turn. Really fantastic card. Coming in at number 3, Cauldron Haze. 1 and a white-black hybrid mana instant. Choose any number of target creatures. Each of those creatures gains persist until end turn. This is just a really great card that can go in any deck. It's just, I save my creatures from a board wipe. As long as they're not 1/1s, obviously if they're 1/1s, they'll just come back into play and die because they're going to enter the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on them. But it is just sort of another option. You know, maybe instead of Flawless Maneuver or an effect like that, I can just pay 2, give all my creatures persist, they'll come back into play with -1/-1 counters on them. It's better than the alternative, but also where this card is particularly good is in any sort of an ETB strategy. You know, if I have an Ashen Rider in play and I use Cauldron Haze on it, it's going to die to that board wipe. I exile a permanent, then it comes back into play and I get to exile another permanent. So if you're in any sort of an ETB strategy in black and white, Cauldron Haze can be particularly good. Or in any sort of strategy where you're sacrificing your creatures a lot and then maybe you get to reuse them again. Coming in at number 4, Cataran Summons. 1 black sorcery. Search your library for a mercenary card. Reveal that card and put it in your hand, then shuffle. So obviously this is just a great card for all those mercenary decks out there, right? We all know everyone's playing mercenary tribal in Commander like crazy. I don't know, maybe a couple people are. And if they are, they probably already have this. Why I'm picking this card is because I just did an Omni-Tribal deck doctor for one of my patrons. I had never actually heard the Omni-Tribal term before. They use that term, and that's the first time I had actually heard it. But essentially the Changeling Tribal. I have a bunch of Lord effects, and then I have a whole bunch of Changelings, and then all those Lord effects are going to pump up all my Changelings. My patron had used the Ur-Dragon as their commander. A lot of people do the Ur-Dragon Changeling Tribal thing because all your Changelings cost 1 less, because they are technically dragons, and they are all technically mercenaries. So Cataran Summons in those decks is just 1 mana, go get any Changeling out of my deck. Put it into my hand. Seems pretty good. Coming in at number 5, Celestial Dawn. And this is a really unique and interesting card. 1 white enchantment. Lands you control are plains. Non-land permanents you control are white. The same is true for spells you control and non-land cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. You may spend white mana as though it were mana of any color. You may spend other mana only as though it were colorless mana. So very powerful effect. This only affects you, right? So it's similar to maybe a Mycosynth Lattice type of effect, except instead of affecting everyone, it only affects you. So there's no way you can hose your opponents with this. You have to use it to advantage you. And how do you do that? I don't know, to be quite honest. Like, playing this in a mono white deck probably won't accomplish a lot. Playing in a deck with a lot of colors, though, might accomplish something. Now I can cast stuff like Acid Rain or Boil and destroy other people's lands, and mine will be fine because my lands are plains. You got to remember, lands you control are plains. That means they're not in addition to their other types. They're only plains and nothing else. It's a tricky one. It's a very powerful effect. It's a very unique card. Thought it would give it a mention. I think it's definitely one of those cards that you could probably build an entire deck around. Coming in at number 6, Cemetery Puka. 1 and 2 black and blue hybrid mana. So a 3 mana, 1/2 shapeshifter. Whenever a creature dies, you may pay 1. If you do, Cemetery Puka becomes a copy of that creature, except it has this ability. I just really like this. There's a lot of clone creatures in the game, obviously. This is one in particular that I think is fantastic in a commander game. Sort of like Mimic Vat a little bit, where you have a Mimic Vat in play, and people play that card all the time in a commander game. If a creature dies, you can choose to exile it and put it on your Mimic Vat. Cemetery Puka, same thing. Creature dies, and hey, maybe I want to turn my Cemetery Puka into that creature. You know, your opponent has a Vorinclex in play. You can kill it, then turn your Cemetery Puka into that Vorinclex. I mean, creatures are always dying in commander games, but in particular in a deck, if you have lots of creature removal, now you get to pick and choose. Now I can pick which opponent's creature I want to copy, and not only do I get to kill their creature, but I get to copy it, and now I get it. Coming in at number 7, Seta Sanctuary. 2 and a blue enchantment. The beginning of your upkeep, if you control a red or green permanent, draw a card, then discard a card. If you control a red permanent and a green permanent, instead draw 2 cards, then discard a card. So you're really going to want to control a red and green permanent with this card. So you're going to want to play a teamer deck, most likely. In a teamer deck, every single turn you're going to be drawing 2 cards and then discarding a card. That's pretty darn good. You're drawing 2 extra cards every turn, so it's great in any deck where you want lots of draw triggers. Maybe you're playing a Kaidel deck, so now you're drawing guaranteed 3 cards. You draw your card that you normally would on your draw step, and then you're going to draw an extra 2, so you're getting 3 draws for sure. So now your Kaidel's going to tap for 3 minimum. Also great in any deck where you want to be looting and maybe putting stuff in your graveyard. I just think, you know, a Frixion Arena, which is a popular card in the format, that nets you 1 extra draw. That's it. You get 1 extra card every turn. This is a 3 mana enchantment that if you have the red and green permanent, you're going to get that extra draw because you're drawing 2 and discarding, so you're netting 1 extra draw. That's basically 1 extra draw every turn. And then the discarding part can be an advantage as well. Gets you the extra draw triggers, gets you that loot effect. I think it's a great card that can go on a few decks. Coming in at number 8, Chain of Smog. 1 and a black sorcery. Target player discards 2 cards. That player may copy this spell and may choose new targets for that copy. So there's sort of a cycle of these chain cards, right? Everyone's familiar, I think, with Chain of Vapor. This is the black one, and I just think it works really, really great if you want everyone to be discarding. Target player discards 2 cards, right? So you choose an opponent, they're going to discard 2 cards. And of course, they're going to copy it, and then they're going to aim it at you. Now, first of all, if you're in a deck where you're discarding your hand and you don't have any cards in hand, now they can't pick you. So this is just 2 mana, make your opponent discard 2 cards. Maybe they aim it at another opponent, and this can just keep going and keep going and keep going. You know, every time you point this at someone, they can then point it at someone else. Also, I think works great in any deck where you want to be discarding. Again, sort of like the Breath Stealer's Crypt that I talked about in my last 10 cards video, how that's great in a deck where you want to be chucking stuff in your graveyard, like in a Cedrus deck. Chain of Smog, same thing. I point this at my opponent, make them discard 2 cards, then almost assuredly they're going to point it back at me, and I get to pick 2 things in my hand that I want in my graveyard, chuck them in there, and now I can use it again and make that opponent discard more things. And you want to keep going? We can keep going all day because I want to discard my hand. You probably don't. So I think it actually works really good in a few different kinds of decks. Coming in at number 9, Centaur Omen Omen Reader. And again, another unusual card from one of my favorite sets, Future Sight. 3 and a green, snow creature, which is interesting. Centaur Shaman. As long as Centaur Omen Reader is tapped, creature spells you cast cost 2 less to cast. That's really significant. So as long as this guy's tapped, all your creature spells are going to cast 2 less. I've never seen this in a commander game. I've never seen it in any game. I don't know if people are playing it or not. Obviously, you can just attack with this. On my first main phase, I'm going to swing with it, attack an opponent where they can chump, but as long as my creature doesn't die, I'm okay. And now it's tapped, and now in my second main phase, I can cast all my creatures, and they're going to be 2 less. That's pretty good. Particularly, though, in any deck where I can be tapping my creatures, okay? So, for example, a Derevi deck where you can be tapping and untapping stuff like crazy. Why doesn't this go in every Derevi deck? Also, in an Archelos deck, Lagoon Mystic. You know, if I was making an Archelos deck, I don't know exactly what people are doing there. Maybe they're doing more of a Staxy thing, but for me, I'm going to do that tap and untap manipulating theme. You know, that's what I'm going to be doing with that deck, so I think Centaur Omen Reader there is also a perfect fit. But even I can just attack with it. I can attack with it, and then on my second main phase, all my creature spells cost 2 less. I think that's pretty darn good. And lastly today, Chaos Moon. And this is a card that I had, man, at least 3 or 4 different people comment on that I should mention it. And it's definitely an interesting one, no question. 3 and a red enchantment. The beginning of each upkeep. Okay, so each player's upkeep, count the number of permanents. If the number is odd until end of turn, red creatures get +1/+1, and whenever a player taps a mountain for mana, that player adds an additional red mana. So all mountains are going to tap for 2 red mana. If the number is even until end of turn, red creatures get -1/-1, and if a player taps a mountain for mana, that mountain produces colorless mana instead of any other type. So basically what's going to happen here is at the beginning of each upkeep, if the number of permanents is odd, that's going to be really good for your red deck. I assume you're probably playing a red, maybe mono red, maybe 2 color, but it's going to be good for you. If the number of stuff in play is odd, that's going to be great for you because your mountains tap for 2 red and your creatures get +1/+1. And if it's even, it's going to be bad for you. This is an interesting inclusion in a deck where you're just kind of screwing around, I guess. If you're doing a chaos deck, obviously it can work. The Ashling's Prerogative deck that I talked about where you're doing an odd and even thing, it could also maybe work, even though the odd and even in that case is a little bit different than this one. You can manipulate it though also. And it's kind of interesting that I had people mention this card because it seems like it's really difficult to use if it doesn't hurt you though, right? If you think about it like this, if I'm playing this in a mono red deck at the beginning of each upkeep, so on my opponent's upkeep, I'm probably not going to be tapping my lands for mana, so I don't care that I get screwed over and they're only producing colorless mana. If I don't have any 1/1 creatures in my deck, the -1/-1 thing doesn't hurt me either. So if I build my deck so that the downside doesn't hurt me at all, it's only going to be upside for me. It's only going to be, I'm going to get the +1/+1 and the extra mana, and then maybe there's a way I can manipulate it so that I can guaranteed get the odd or even. So just off the top of my head, Rakamar, okay? Rakamar is a legendary creature, human shaman, 2 red, 2/2. Not a lot of Rakamar decks out there. There's only 24 decks on EDH Rec. Has haste and pay 1 red and tap, create a 3/1 red elemental creature token with haste. So I can create a permanent that is going to manipulate this effect. Okay, so at the beginning of my upkeep on my turn, this trigger goes on the stack and I quickly count the number of permanents in play, and if it's odd, then I'm fine and I don't have to worry about it. I let the effect take place, and then on my turn, I can do whatever I want. The effect has already resolved. If it's even though, now I can pay the 1 red, put the elemental creature token into play, then it's going to resolve. And again, I'm going to manipulate it so that it's now odd. So either way, I win. If the number is even, I put an elemental creature in play to make it odd. If the number is odd, then I don't do anything. I wait till it resolves. That being said, though, you're putting 3/1 elemental creature tokens into play. So maybe on your opponent's turn, they all die when they get the -1/-1. I don't know. It's a tough card to use, most certainly. You are still getting the mana boost though, right? If you're only using your Rakamar to manipulate the number of permanents in play and you don't really care about the elemental tokens, it's just I'm getting a huge mana boost on my turn. I mean, every mountain tapping for double mana, if you're in a mono red deck, that's really good. Definitely an interesting card, and I'm sure there's a few people that will comment on different ways that you can use it. I'm not familiar with it myself. I've never seen it in a Commander game. It's super unique and super unusual. The one thing though that I did have another person mention about Chaos Moon is in a real life game, it can get super annoying having to every upkeep count the amount of permanents in play, and it slows the game down a lot. So there's also that. So maybe you want to save this for playing online. I don't know. Definitely a unique and interesting card that I think probably deserves a mention. And for the 3 or 4 people out there that wanted me to mention it, there it is. Give it a try, see if it works for you. But that is it for today. That is 10 more cards you should be putting in your Commander decks. And if you're thinking of purchasing any of these cards, click on my TCG player link. It just helps support the channel. But that is all, and thanks for tuning in.